Welcome back to Smarty Van. Today we're in Anza Borrego Desert State Park. I'm Mike, and I live with my partner Shar, and our 2022 4x4 Sprinter that we built from the ground up is a home automated DIY home on wheels. Today I'm going to show you how to get vehicle data from the OBD port into Home Assistant. Although you could use any home automation platform because we're going to use MQTT. All right, we have a lot to get through, so let's get to work. Okay, today we're talking about how to pull information from your vehicle via the OBD port, the onboard diagnostics port, into Home Assistant. We're ultimately going to use MQTT, so even if you're not using Home Assistant, you might find this video useful. Also, the device I'm about to show you is Bluetooth and Wi-Fi enabled, which means this device is compatible with other apps like Car Scanner, Real Dash, and SavvyCam. So you might find parts of this video useful even if you're not using a home automation platform. But like I said, we're focused on pulling information from the vehicle into Home Assistant via the OBD port. I should also note that we're in a 2022 Mercedes Sprinter, which is a VS30. While most of this information should work on any vehicle that's modern, you might find slight differences in your vehicle. Okay, so this is the WiCAN OBD by MeatPi. It's made by a single developer, Ali Slim, who has a range of devices, but this one is an OBD reader. It is based on an ESP32, and it has an OBD interface. There's only 4 pins being used here. It's ground, 12 volts, CAN high, and CAN low. So yes, this is interfacing with the CAN bus of your vehicle, but it's going over the OBD-II port standard, which has been standardized and used since the mid-90s in all vehicles, which means there are standard PIDs or parameter IDs that are available to any scanner like this or other ones that you may have used to pull diagnostics information from your vehicle, like vehicle speed, RPMs, and fuel levels. I have been using the Mercedes Me integration in Home Assistant, which has been great to pull in all kinds of information from the vehicle, but it relies on the cellular connection of the vehicle. And as you can imagine, being full-time van lifers, we're often in places where our van does not have cell connection. And unfortunately, try as I might, I have not figured out a way to put the van itself on the Wi-Fi network in our van, which would give it access to our Starlink or other cellular connection. So if the van is not in cellular range, all the information for this integration stops being updated. So it's not very useful if you're trying to rely on it. So I wanted to find a solution that met our requirements, which is that everything must work offline if possible. And using this device allows us to pull vehicle information into Home Assistant locally without relying on an internet connection. So the WiCAN OBD is one of several devices that Ali Slim manufactures via his company, MeatPi. There's also a version of this that is a USB version, which instead of using an OBD connector, gives you access to the CAN high, CAN low, 12 volts, and ground, which you could wire directly into your vehicle CAN bus system. There's also a pro version of this device in development that you can pre-order through Crowd Supply, and I'll link to that below. That device is more powerful and is going to allow you to clear codes and perform diagnostics like a full-featured reader. But for now, the WiCAN OBD is perfectly capable for what I need to do, which is pull some information from the vehicle into Home Assistant. I'll link to Ali's company MeatPi below, as well as links to the WiCAN OBD, the WiCAN USB, and the Crowd Supply link for the WiCAN Pro coming soon. Ali is an incredible developer, and I hope you support MeatPi by pre-ordering a WiCAN Pro, but for today, we're going to focus on the WiCAN OBD. SAE standards define a common set of parameters, or PIDs, that should be available across all vehicles. I'll link down below to the Wikipedia article listing all of the standard PIDs. I also should note that this list is a little bit more limited than something like the Mercedes Me integration that can pull data from a wider range of ECUs in the vehicle, including things like tire pressure and ignition status. Those two things are not standard PIDs in the OBD-II spec. So while we may not get as much data from the vehicle, we can get data locally and in real time. Standardizing the PIDs that are available across all OBD-II ports in all vehicles ensured compatibility with universal diagnostics tools and allows the development of something like the WiCAN OBD. One of the specified features of OBD-II is that you can ask the car for the available PIDs. So in the latest version of the firmware for the WiCAN OBD, Ali has written in the ability to scan for the available PIDs in the vehicle and quickly add them to the list of the PIDs that you're interested in. So you'll be able to use any of the PIDs that are available in your vehicle, but let's take a look at the ones that I'm interested in. You'll see here on my cab dashboard that I built that I'm pulling in the vehicle's speed in miles per hour, and I'm calculating the approximate range based on the size of our fuel tank. We have an aftermarket tank that's 40 gallons, and I'm just doing a crude calculation to estimate our range based on our average fuel consumption. Below that, you'll see I'm pulling in the diesel level and the def level. Next to that, I'm pulling in coolant temp and the ambient air temp. And below that, I'm pulling in our odometer and our battery voltage, which is the voltage at the ECU, which stands for Engine Control Unit, which is the actual device we're talking to with our OBD reader. At the top, I have an indicator that shows if our WiCAN is connected or not, and I'm also showing another sensor that I use separate from CAN bus to show if the van is running or not, and that's an ignition sensor. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Finally, the last sensor I'm pulling in is the engine runtime since last ignition. One thing I should note here is that when you turn the ignition off, the ECU stops reporting data to the WiCAN over OBD, and so we don't get any new information. I've chosen in Home Assistant to configure these sensors to freeze the last data point that they had rather than showing as unavailable or unknown. I mentioned earlier that you can use the Bluetooth or Wi-Fi on the WiCAN OBD to connect to various apps on your computer or smartphone to monitor your vehicle stats in real time. But what we're going to do today is to use this device to connect to Home Assistant, and there's two ways that we can do that. Another developer named Jay Oswald has been working on a Home Assistant integration for the WiCAN OBD. It's in alpha right now, so it's in pretty early stages, but it does work. There are some limitations I've noticed, including the units of the sensors not coming through to Home Assistant just yet. I also spoke with Ali at MeatPi and realized that the Home Assistant integration is only hitting the WiCAN endpoint every 30 seconds. So if you want sensors that are updated more often than that, we have to go another route. I've chosen to use the MQTT feature of the WiCAN OBD, which allows us to publish the PID data from the vehicle into MQTT topics using a period that's specific for each sensor data. So if you want the speedometer to update more often than the engine coolant temp, we can set that up. If you're like me and you're already using MQTT for other applications in your Home Assistant setup, then you're already halfway there. If not, don't worry, I'll link to some video clips below where I walk you through how to set up an MQTT broker in Home Assistant. Okay, to get started, the first thing we're going to do is take our WiCAN OBD and plug it into the onboard diagnostics port of our vehicle. Usually that's found in the dashboard, underneath, around the steering wheel area, and the driver's seat well. You'll likely have to turn your vehicle to ignition on to provide power to the device, although if you've recently opened the doors or locked and unlocked the vehicle, there may be power for a short period on the OBD port. And to receive data from the vehicle continuously, you're likely going to need to turn the ignition all the way on. Once the device is powered up, you should see it appear under your list of Wi-Fi devices from your computer or smartphone. You should look for a device called WiCAN _ and then it has the ID of your specific device. You should be able to connect to the WiCAN access point using the password @MeatPi # as the default password. Once you've connected to the access point, you can navigate to 192.168.80.1 in your browser to access the user interface. I should note that I'm using firmware version 4.0.3, which was just released. There might be an even newer version by the time that you receive your WiCAN. On the first page, you should see the status of your device. One thing you may want to take note of on the status page is the MDNS field. This is the host name where you can reach this device no matter what the IP address is. So it should be WiCAN _ and then the ID of your device .local. The first thing that we want to do is configure the Wi-Fi. We'll switch to the settings tab and we'll change the mode of the AP config to AP plus station. Then down below in station config, you can type in the SSID of your Wi-Fi network either in your vehicle or wherever your Home Assistant install is. Then add the password for that Wi-Fi network and set the correct security protocol. Under the CAN section, we need to make sure we set the protocol to auto PID. There are other protocols here that can be selected if you're using some of the other softwares that are compatible with this reader, but for what we're doing in Home Assistant, we need auto PID. And then we'll enable MQTT. If you're going to use the Home Assistant integration instead of MQTT, you can leave this disabled. We'll leave Bluetooth disabled, and now we need to set up our MQTT settings. If you already have an MQTT broker running on your Home Assistant install on a container or elsewhere, then you should know the MQTT IP address and the port number, your user, and your password. If you don't already have that set up, I'm going to link to a video and a chapter down below where I walk you through how to set up Mosquito Broker in Home Assistant. You can also find instructions online for other ways to install a broker on other platforms. In my case, I'm using the Mosquito Broker add-on in Home Assistant, so I'll be using the IP address of my Home Assistant install to reach that broker. I'm also using the default port of the Mosquito broker, which is 1883. And I've set up a user in Home Assistant that's exclusively for MQTT access, and that user is MQTT_user, and my password for that user is MQTT. I'll link down below again to another video and chapter marker where I walk you through how to set up a user for MQTT in Home Assistant. Down below that, you can enable the TX and RX topics, which is basically going to send every transmission and receipt of a CAN frame from the OBD reader into your MQTT broker. That's a lot of information flying by, and we really don't need it for what we're doing, so I'm going to leave those unchecked. Next is the status topic. By default, you can see it includes the ID of your particular reader, but I've decided to shorten that just to make things a little more concise to WiCAN/status. This is the topic where the WiCAN OBD is going to publish its online or offline status to your MQTT broker. So you can really make this path anything that you like, but you'll see as we add standard PIDs in a moment that this is the format I'm using, WiCAN/topic. Okay, at the bottom, we'll hit Submit Changes, and this should cause your WiCAN OBD to restart and join the Wi-Fi network that you provided credentials for. It's also going to start publishing data to your MQTT broker, and at this point, that should only include the status. Okay, now that you've configured and restarted your device, it should join the Wi-Fi network that you provided credentials for, which means it now has a new IP address. If you took note of the MDNS hostname on the status page when we first loaded the user interface, then you should be able to access your device at that hostname. Otherwise, you could go to your router and look at your client list and find the WiCAN OBD and grab the IP address of the device and paste it into your browser. I don't tend to rely on MDNS on my PepLink router because I have various subnets. Although MDNS hostnames should work, I tend to prefer to give DHCP reservations for devices so I can access them at a known IP address. So I've given a reservation to my WiCAN OBD in my router, and I'm going to use that IP address to access the interface from here on out. We haven't configured any vehicle data yet, but we should be publishing the status of the OBD device to our MQTT broker. So let's go check the broker and make sure that information is coming through. I like to use an app called MQTT Explorer, which I talk about in a prior video, and I'll link to that chapter down below if you need to get that set up. So I'll open MQTT Explorer here, and I'm going to connect to the Mosquito broker that I'm running on my Home Assistant install. And once we're connected, we'll see that I'm receiving all kinds of information from my other integrations, but I don't see anything from WiCAN yet. And that's because the only information that's been published is the status, and that was published before we opened MQTT Explorer. So I'm going to go back to the browser and navigate down to System, and I'm going to reboot the device so we republish the status. Then I'll go back to MQTT Explorer, and we should see as this reboot that we get a WiCAN topic. There we go. And the only subtopic is status. And the bit of JSON here says status is online. So now we know our WiCAN OBD device is correctly publishing to our MQTT broker. If you don't see this status, even after restarting your WiCAN device, then something is not correctly configured either with your broker or the MQTT credentials that you've provided to the WiCAN OBD in the user interface. Okay, to get data from our vehicle into Home Assistant using MQTT, we need to tell the WiCAN OBD which PIDs we're interested in. There's a few ways to do this, including custom PIDs or vehicle profiles, but the easiest way, and what I'm going to talk about today, is using standard PIDs. These are the PIDs defined by the OBD-II standard and should be available across all modern cars. So the first thing we're going to do is switch to the Automate tab and scroll down to Standard PIDs. We'll enable standard PIDs, then we need to set the ECU protocol. I know that in a Mercedes Sprinter VS30, we're going to be using Protocol 7, which includes 29-bit IDs, which are the extended IDs, and the baud rate of the CAN bus is at 500K. So I'll choose ECU Protocol 7. If you don't happen to know which protocol your vehicle uses, you can really just try all 4 of these. So we're going to set this to 7, and then we're going to scan for PIDs. Once the scan is complete, you should be able to see the list of PIDs that are available in this drop-down menu. If you select one of these PIDs, then you can click Add, and it will add it to your list of standard PIDs that are going to be sent to your MQTT broker. This is the list of PIDs that I showed you on my dashboard, and it includes vehicle speed, engine coolant temp, ambient air temp, time sense engine start, the odometer, the fuel tank level, the diesel exhaust fluid sensor data, and the control module voltage, which is effectively the voltage of our starter battery. If we open one of these PIDs, you can see that it has a name that's automatically added, which includes the actual PID and the name of the PID. I'm not going to get into receive headers, but those may be necessary in certain circumstances with certain vehicles, although I found it wasn't necessary with the Sprinter. The period in milliseconds is the polling rate, the rate at which we're going to ask the engine ECU for the data response. So in something like vehicle speed, I'm asking for that every 1 second. And the destination type I'm setting to MQTT topic, and I'm going to define that topic below. If you remember from the MQTT status topic, we started with WiCAN, a slash, and then the subtopic that we want the information published to. So I'm using WiCAN/vehicle_speed. If you look at the rest of these, you'll notice that they're configured almost identically, except for the period. Some of these things like engine coolant temp, I don't need every second. Instead, I'm pulling that every 5 seconds. Same thing with ambient air temp, and the time with the engine start is also 5 seconds. The odometer I'm pulling even less frequently at 20,000 milliseconds, which is 20 seconds. Same with the fuel tank level and the diesel exhaust fluid sensor data. The control module voltage, or essentially the battery voltage, I'm pulling every 5 seconds. And you'll note that I'm using the same topic path format for each of these, WiCAN/ and then the name of the PID, and I'm just using underscores instead of spaces. Once you've added and configured all of the standard PIDs that you want after scanning and choosing from the list, then you could go to the bottom and click Submit Changes. You should see a notification at the top that your configuration was saved and the device will reboot. Now that our WiCAN device is restarted, we should be able to switch back to MQTT Explorer and see those topics start to populate and refresh at the periods that we set. 5 seconds for some, 1 second for other, and 20 seconds for the remaining. You'll see the topic data is a JSON formatted key value pair, including the name of the PID and the actual value itself. Now that we know that that's working, we can go over to Home Assistant and start configuring our MQTT sensors to bring that data into Home Assistant. Okay, quick break here just to say that we've turned on super thanks down below this video. If you're enjoying the content we're making, feel like you're learning something, and you want to contribute to help us keep this channel running, that's great. If not, that's great too. We're also talking about turning on channel memberships, but we'll get to that in a future video. All right, let's get back to work. Now that we know data is being published to our MQTT broker, we can configure MQTT sensors in Home Assistant to bring that data in. I'm going to be using Studio Code Server, which I'll link to down below. It's an add-on for Home Assistant that allows you to edit configuration files. But you can access your configuration files any way you'd like. So I'm going to go into my Home Assistant install and navigate to Studio Code Server. If you don't have Studio Code Server set up and you'd like to, I have a video, and I'll link to that video and chapter down below where I walk you through how to set that up. When configuring custom YAML for my Home Assistant install, I like to keep things organized by using the packages feature. I have a video and a chapter about that linked down below to help walk you through that if you don't have it set up. But in brief, you can navigate to your configuration.yaml and add the packages integration, which looks like this: packages, and then exclamation include directory name, and I'm using the directory packages. This is under the Home Assistant integration. You'll have to restart if you're setting this up for the first time. Once you've done that, you can add the directory named packages in your config folder, and you'll be able to organize any custom configuration in that directory, and any configuration you add will be loaded into the main Home Assistant configuration. So in the packages directory, I've added another directory called WiCAN, and inside that, I've added a YAML file called WiCAN.yaml. This is where I'll be configuring all of the MQTT sensors for our WiCAN OBD. I'll link to all this configuration in a gist down below so that you can follow along, copy and paste, and modify as needed. At the top, you'll see I have a template sensor to start things off, and all I'm doing here is calculating our approximate range using some very rough math using a sensor that's defined below called sensor.WiCAN fuel level. This is the percentage of fuel remaining in our diesel tank. I'm simply multiplying that by our 40-gallon tank and our 11 miles per hour average fuel consumption to get an approximate range. You can do fancier math using the mass airflow PID and some other sensors to get a more accurate and evolving fuel range depending on how you're driving, but this is good enough for me to account for the fact that we have an aftermarket fuel tank. Below that is where we get into the actual MQTT sensor definition. So we define the MQTT integration, and then first we're going to define a binary sensor, and this is simply the status for the WiCAN OBD. Is it connected to the MQTT broker or not? So we're going to set a state topic, which is WiCAN status, and if we flip back to the MQTT Explorer, you can see that it's WiCAN/status. Then we're going to give this a name. I just called this OBD status. You could call this WiCAN OBD status or whatever you like. And then we need a unique ID. I recommend that you replace my unique IDs just to ensure that these are unique for your install. You can delete this unique ID, and if you're using Visual Code Studio, you can right-click and choose Generate UUID at Cursor for a new UUID. You can also use UUIDgenerator.net, which I'll link below, to generate random UUIDs. To determine the state of the binary sensor, we're using payload on and payload off. If we look back at MQTT Explorer, we can see the full JSON value of status, which is status:online. So that'll either say online or offline. There are a couple ways you can define this binary sensor, but the easiest thing for me was just to put the entire JSON payload, since we know it's always going to be either status online or status offline, to define whether this sensor should be on or off. Then I'm going to define a device. I talked about this in my Victron integration video, which I'll link down below, but basically we want to help group all these sensors together into a device in Home Assistant so that they're easier to find and look at all together. So we'll give it an identifier, which I'm using WiCAN. If you want, you could define a configuration URL, which will help you quickly access the device from your Home Assistant install on the device page when you want to configure the WiCAN OBD device. In my case, I'm using the DHCP reserved IP address for the device, but you could also use the hostname. The manufacturer is MeatPi, and the model is the WiCAN OBD, and the name is simply WiCAN. Below that, I'm defining the sensor integration, and then I'm going to create a list of various sensors to pull in all that data from the broker that's coming from the WiCAN OBD. The first one I'm defining is vehicle speed, and the state topic for that is WiCAN/vehicle_speed. If we look back at MQTT Explorer, you can see that here in the list of topics. Then we'll give it a friendly name, vehicle speed, and another unique ID. Be sure to replace that. Then I'm going to define an icon using the MDI library, which I'll link to down below, and I'm using the speedometer icon. The device class here is speed, and the state class is a measurement. The unit of measurement is going to be miles per hour. And then I'm going to define the value of the sensor using the value template. So let's go back to MQTT Explorer to look at this topic. If we look at the vehicle speed topic, you'll see that we have a JSON key value pair. The key is 0D-vehicle speed, and the value is likely 0 if you're sitting still. So in this value template, I'm asking for the key 0D-vehicle speed of the value JSON blob that came through. Because this value is coming in as kilometers per hour, I'm going to do some calculation here to convert this to miles per hour. So the first thing I do is define a default, which is 0, and I'm going to multiply that by 0.61371, which is the equation to convert kilometers per hour to miles per hour. The next thing I'm going to do is round that off. I don't want too many decimal places here, so I'm going to round this to a whole number. Below that, I have availability configuration commented out. I've chosen to have my sensors hold their last value when the ignition's turned off because I don't want those sensors going unavailable and kind of messing up my dashboards, but this is up to you. One way to do this is to use the status topic of the WiCAN OBD, and when the payload is online, then the status will be available. And if the payload is offline, then this sensor will become unavailable. And below that, we'll define the device just like we did above. I'm not going to go through all the rest of my sensor configuration because they're almost identical, with slight changes to the device class and the unit of measurement. I'm also doing different math for conversions from Celsius to Fahrenheit and kilometers to miles, but that's all pretty self-explanatory, and you can check that out on the gist I linked below. If you take a look at the Wikipedia link I have down below for the OBD-II Standard PIDs, you'll see a spreadsheet with all the standard PIDs and which unit the value is expected to come in. Most of those are going to be Celsius and kilometers per hour, etc. So I'm always converting those values to empirical values. Once you've defined all of the MQTT sensors in your configuration file, you could go over to the Developers tab and reload the manually configured MQTT entities. Once you've done that, we can go to Settings, Devices and Services, and the MQTT integration. Click Devices, and you should find your WiCAN device. And you'll see all the sensors listed there with their values. If something doesn't look right, check your sensor configuration and make sure to check these values against the display in your vehicle to make sure you've got the correct values. If you want to set up other PIDs, you can go take a look at the lists that are available in the WiCAN interface, and then you can add the appropriate configuration to your MQTT sensor configuration in Home Assistant. So here we have all of the sensors that I've configured, and if we go over to my CAD dashboard, you'll be able to see all of that information displayed with nice gauges. You can of course lay this out however you want, but I find this useful while driving just to double check how things are looking on the coolant temp, the ambient air temp, our approximate range, and our speed. One of my favorite sensors is the speedometer, and it's not because I don't want to look at the speedometer in the vehicle, it's actually because I want to trigger automations when the vehicle starts moving. We of course use GPS for this as well, but that's a little bit slower to validate that the vehicle's truly in motion. When the speedometer rises above 0, it's pretty guaranteed that the vehicle's in motion. So you could use a combination of GPS and the speedometer, or just the speedometer, to trigger things like turning off your lights and water pump and other things that you want to be off while the vehicle's moving. All right, this is a quick but very important tip for your WiCAN OBD device configuration. If you go back to the UI for your WiCAN OBD and switch to the power savings tab, you'll see that there's a sleep mode. This allows the WiCAN device to use the battery voltage to determine whether or not the engine is on and whether the device should go to deep sleep. This will consume far less power and will preserve your starter battery. So you set the sleep mode to enable, and then you choose a voltage threshold. The default of 13.1 is working great for our Mercedes Sprinter because the voltage should rise above that when the ignition's on and should drop below that when the ignition is off. And then you could choose a sleep after duration for the length of time you want to keep the WiCAN OBD active after the ignition has been turned off. Then click Submit Changes and your device will restart. And next time the battery voltage drops below the threshold, it'll go to sleep and keep your starter battery safe. I'm sure some of you are going to be curious about the van running or not running sensor I have here at the top. That's the only sensor on this page that's not actually coming from the WiCAN OBD. I'm using a Shelly to detect 12 volts on the D+ post under the driver's seat in our Mercedes Sprinter to know if the ignition is on or off. When you turn the ignition off, the ECU stops publishing data, including the battery voltage. The WiCAN device can still detect voltage on the OBD port, but it's not currently publishing that to MQTT. I know Alloy's working on a feature for future firmware that will continue publishing the battery voltage to the MQTT broker so that we could use voltage to determine whether the ignition is off or on. It's not currently available, but keep your eyes on firmware updates. When that comes, you may be able to use that to detect your ignition. All right, that's how we're pulling data from our 2022 Mercedes Sprinter into Home Assistant using a WiCAN OBD reader and MQTT. As always, I've dropped tons of links down in the description below, including my configuration file and links to a ton of resources, as well as videos and chapters to help you set up some of the add-ons I've used in Home Assistant. We've also turned on super thanks down below this video. If you want to help out, it helps us keep the channel running. We're also looking at turning on membership tiers, which will allow early access to some of our videos, as well as member-exclusive videos, and maybe some other fun perks. Drop some comments below if you have ideas or things that you would like to be included in membership tiers. And if you have comments or questions, drop them down below, and we'll do our best to help out. Until next time, safe travels.